Okay, we're live, getting ready. It's supposed to start in 2 minutes. So please, everybody, leave a comment with your name. You earn extra credit by asking a question. You have a timer set?
Oh, am I supposed to paint them now?
Nope, 5 minutes. Now, put the gloves on, dump the liquid out. Yes, while we're getting ready to do the review class, I'm coaching my son through finishing up a little bit of barbecue. So, got to have the priorities in order. Okay, so again, tonight we're doing a little bit of AP review for Supreme Court cases. That's a topic that typically I do an entire night on when we do our live review classes. I just said live. Our in-person, face-to-face review classes. We're going to do this way tonight. Guys, if you want your extra credit, you need to ask me a question. There is no such thing as a dumb question. I just feel a lot better when I know you're asking me, okay? Usually a topic kids stress out about a lot. Remember, there's no multiple choice this year. It's all short answer, and they're supposed to give us the particulars of what the test is going to be on April 3rd. But if it's a short answer or there's an essay or whatever they're going to give us, Supreme Court cases are great history-specific details. It's also a great way for us just to review all the 7 time periods that'll be on the AP test. So the plan is to be outside. There is a 47% chance of rain. So, say a couple of these, and hopefully it doesn't rain on us. Otherwise, we'll have to find a place to move. I think James is watching the Sonic the Hedgehog movie. So we might be stuck like hiding in a bedroom or on the stairs or something. Again, Supreme Court cases. I need questions from you guys tonight. That's how we're going to do this. I'm going to start with my shtick, and we'll go from there. Okay? So make sure you sign in. And again, this will be posted up on YouTube after the fact, so that if you want to speed through and get some stuff, that's great. Helena, tell Gianna and Marissa to send you questions, and you type them in with Marissa wants to know, Gianna wants to know. Okay? All right. So, hey, we're here. It is March 31st, 2 days away from the coolest month of the year, April. And we're here in Mr. Ash's backyard. As you can see, been kicked out of the house so I can do AP review. And it'll be a little bit distracting. You might see one of my kids walk by because I'm cheating tonight. No charcoal, lazy man ribs. All right. So tonight we're talking about Supreme Court cases, guys. And this is a topic, that's on the Regents every year. It's a topic that's great material for essays, for short answers, because you always need those specific details. So I'm going to run through. I did post on our Google Classroom. I hope you saw it. Give me a thumbs up, little emoji or something on there if you've seen it. Maybe 2 thumbs up if you actually opened it. I made a Google slideshow for you guys on Supreme Court cases. It's amazing. I was able to figure out how to do it. You guys know how I am about computers. I'm a monkey with a Rubik's Cube, but it's got hyperlinks on there to videos, pictures, all kinds of stuff. So I hope you check that out. It goes periods 1 through 7, and then I actually have stuff that goes for periods 8 and 9. You don't need to really worry about that right now. The only one you might want to check out just because is Brown versus Board of Education, because it would be perfect for finishing up Plessy versus Ferguson. All right, so I have a little deal planned, but I'm seeing questions already. So let's go to Olivia Grabowski. She wants to know about Gibbons versus Ogden. All right, so here's the deal. The state of New York issued a monopoly to Robert Fulton and one of his business partners. Remember, Fulton was the guy who invented the steamboat, to run a ferry service across the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey. Well, eventually what happened was Fulton kind of like subcontracted out, and he sent his rights to run this ferry monopoly to Ogden. So Ogden has the rights to run a monopoly to ferry people across the Hudson River, given to him from the state of New York. Gibbons, the same, is a different guy. He gets a monopoly, but his is from the federal government. This is a John Marshall Supreme Court case, and that's important. We know about John Marshall. We'll talk about him tonight. He's a big deal for period 4. Marshall is the guy who invents the whole concept of judicial review. He's the guy who basically makes up the power that the Supreme Court has. The other thing to remember about Marshall, and it's one of my little tricks for the AP test and the Regents, if you see John Marshall's name on the AP test or the Regents, the answer is either judicial review or he gives more power to the national government. Okay? That's big, guys. You have to remember that. So Marshall ends up ruling in favor of the federal government, saying, look, only the federal government in the Constitution has the right to regulate what we call interstate, meaning crossing state lines commerce, interstate commerce. And this is a good example of what we call federalism, the sharing of power between the state and national governments. Powers that we specifically assign, check those ribs, John. Powers that we, hey, barbecue and history tonight. Powers we specifically assign to the national government, we call those delegated powers. And in the Constitution, under the 10th Amendment, any powers not specifically delegated to the national government are automatically reserved for the states. So we have powers specifically given the national government, like a post office, interstate commerce, meaning business that goes across state lines, coining money, declaring war, treaties, post office. Those are interstate powers. Reserved powers are everything that's left over, meaning local businesses, speed limits, drinking ages, education, hey, New York State Regents. So Marshall and Gibbons versus Ogden takes the side of the national government. Effectively, if you can know this, look, guys, he creates judicial review in Marbury versus Madison. Otherwise, if you see a Marshall court case, anything from 1801 when he gets appointed until he dies in 1835. So from Marbury versus Madison up to and including Worcester versus Georgia, it's something about giving more power to the national government. All right, Jake wants to know about Korematsu versus the United States. So now you're going to brush him, and as you brush him, put him on. Coaching this kid through, man. Look at this. That's dedication to his craft. Okay, so Korematsu versus the U.S. One of the big things to always remember is what happens to your rights in a time of war, your civil rights, your civil liberties, they go bye-bye. We've talked about this time and again, and I've got that in the court case Google slide. We have, during the Civil War, a court case called Ex parte Merriman. It deals with Abraham Lincoln locking up the Copperheads. Hopefully you guys remember them. If not, they need to go on your list for studying for the AP test. Lincoln locks up the Copperheads, or peace Democrats, Northern Democrats who were kind of pro-South or at least anti-war effort. He does this by suspending the writ of habeas corpus, your right to actually be charged with a crime before you're locked up. In this case, Merriman's a Copperhead. The case goes to Roger Taney, remember him, the Dred Scott guy? And Taney tells Lincoln, you have no authority to suspend habeas corpus. Only Congress can do that. Remember, one of our little brainwashings, what's Lincoln's number one goal? Preserve the Union. And Lincoln goes, oh yeah, Taney, say I can't do that? Watch me. Okay? And Lincoln ignores Taney, and he keeps the Copperheads locked up again. Lincoln's going to do anything he can to preserve the Union. We talked about Schenck versus the U.S. And if I say Schenck versus the U.S., you say clear and present danger. How the Supreme Court upheld the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Charles Schenck was a member of the Socialist Party. He was a big shot in the Socialist Party. And what they ended up doing was Schenck had printed out pamphlets, like 15,000 of them, telling men, don't obey draft laws. So he got locked up for violating the Espionage Acts. Schenck said, look, I got First Amendment rights. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, but in a time of war, your rights can be limited if they represent a clear and present danger. So they even went so far as to make a little analogy. They said, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Now we set up Korematsu versus the United States. During World War II, because Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and there were so many people of Japanese ancestry. Notice how I don't say Japanese immigrants. You could be a person whose parents came over to America, whose grandparents came over to America, people of Japanese ancestry. There were so many of them along the West Coast. Americans were paranoid that there would be an invasion and that, there were spies and saboteurs. And FDR passed what was called Executive Order 9066, the executive order that called for the internment of Japanese Americans. One of the worst moments in American history, guys. Fred Korematsu was arrested for refusing to report to one of these internment camps and leave what was called a military restricted zone. Korematsu appealed. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1944, and his basis was on the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. The Fifth Amendment, the Due Process Clause. And that's a great term to know for a lot of things for periods 1 through 7. The Due Process Clause, the idea that the government cannot take away your right to life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the 14th Amendment, which also not only contains a due process clause, but has what we call the Equal Protection Clause. You know, all citizens have equal protection under the law. And Korematsu is saying, look, you're depriving me of my rights because I am of Japanese ancestry. You know, his grandparents came here from Japan. And the Supreme Court ruled that the internment of Japanese Americans, hey, go get my phone out of the bedroom, please, was a, quote, military necessity. Okay? And that really is a stain on the United States. It won't be until 1988 that the federal government finally tried to make right. They gave restitution out to the people who were still alive who had been in these camps, so something like $25,000. Fred Korematsu got a Presidential Medal of Freedom from Bill Clinton, but obviously that doesn't make up for what happened. Okay? All right, scrolling through your comments here. Bear with me. And all right, Gino wants to know more about Schenck versus the U.S. Again, big things, guys. Clear and present danger. Your freedom of speech can be limited. That's always important to remember in war times. It's a World War I case, and connect it to something. Connect it to Korematsu. Connect it to Lincoln with the Copperheads. Even if you can't remember the name of the case, Ex parte Merriman, if you just say Lincoln, blew off the Supreme Court during the Civil War, that's a good connection. Helena, what are the most important cases to know for the test? Oy vey. All right, Marbury versus Madison, because you can't have judicial review without it. If you're going to write anything about the power of the Supreme Court, you got to at least kind of get a throwaway in there that Marshall created judicial review. Worcester versus Georgia, that's in my Google slide. That's the one that Andrew Jackson ignores. He blows off the Supreme Court, and it leads to the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. The case where Roger Taney, the guy who replaces John Marshall, declares the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. Taney goes so far as to say that slaves not only could not be citizens, but they were considered like less than people. Taney says slaves are property, not people. They have no standing in the court. Again, he declares the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, and that's in 1857. That's one of the big things, guys, that pushes America towards civil war. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. The Supreme Court case that upheld the Jim Crow laws, established the doctrine of separate but equal, basically legalized segregation until 1954 when the Supreme Court overturned segregation in Brown versus Board of Education, at least in terms of schools. I would throw in for AP, Munn versus Illinois and Wabash versus Illinois. Those two cases both deal with the Granger laws, Munn in 1877, Wabash in 1886, and the question of, how much regulation could states do for industries like the railroads. In Munn, the Supreme Court gave the thumbs up to Granger laws that restricted warehouses that stored grain. In 1886, the Supreme Court struck down the Granger laws and declared them unconstitutional because they said, look, Illinois, you're not allowed to regulate railroads. They go across state lines. It's that Wabash case that leads to the creation of the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Other big ones, I would definitely 100% say at least Northern Securities versus the U.S. or Standard Oil versus the U.S., one of those cases dealing with trust busting. The Northern Securities case, that's the one where Teddy first breaks up a trust. Standard Oil case, you could go to Muckrakers and talk about Ida Tarbell because she's the one who wrote History of Standard Oil and how the Muckrakers led Teddy to investigate and sue. Schenck we talked about. I would say 100% Schechter Poultry versus the U.S., the sick chicken case, the case that struck down the New Deal NRA, okay, the Blue Eagle. That was the case that really led to court packing and, Korematsu. Those are the 100% guaranteed. Like, if they're not on the AP test, they're on the Regents. But really look over the ones I gave you. All right, we've got some other cases here. Munn versus Illinois. All right, Munn versus Illinois. It's 1877. The railroads are the biggest monopoly around. And a lot of the Midwestern states, like Illinois, they have so many farmers. These farmers start to band together and vote like in what are called blocks. They all vote the same way. And they put a lot of pressure on their state governments. And what they end up doing is they pressure their governments to do something about not just the railroads, but the warehouses, the grain storage, elevators. And let's see here. How's John doing? I'm going to say turn the couple that are very done. You get them off, John. All right. We'll critique John's barbecue skills later on. But the Granger law. So in Munn, Illinois creates a Granger law that says, look, warehouses, this is the max you can charge. The warehouses sue, and the Supreme Court takes the side of Illinois, and they say, look, you might be a private company, but in this case, because you're something that the public needs, you're what we now call a public utility. Like we think about National Grid or the phone company, internet companies. And as a result, the government has the right to regulate you. Now, 9 years later, you get Wabash versus Illinois, the Wabash St. Louis Railroad. They go to court against Illinois because Illinois had a law that set maximum railroad rates. In this case, the Supreme Court gave a big old thumbs down and said, no. You can't regulate those railroad rates because railroads go across state lines. That really tweaked the Grangers, made a lot of people in the Midwest angry, and that's what led to the creation, again, of the ICC. Hope that helped you there. Bennett, again, clear and present danger. That's one of our brainwashings. We'll have to do a brainwashing by video. That's Schenck versus the U.S. Your freedom of speech can be limited if it represents a clear and present danger. Jimmy, insular cases. All right. This is just a good little detail. If you have to write about American imperialism, it's a good little one to stick in there. One of the results of imperialism is, we go plunking our flag all over the world. Now, all of a sudden, we have a lot of places that all of a sudden, hey, by the way, you're owned by America. And now the question becomes, well, are we Americans? Do we get the same rights of Americans? And this is actually a bunch of cases that happened between 1901 and 1903. John, get the dog in. So my kid's got a tray full of ribs, and he's going to walk inside because he's phone obsessed, and the dog's outside. Okay. So anyway, the insular cases. The Supreme Court rules. Look, the Constitution does not automatically follow the flag. And this kind of really focused a lot on Puerto Rico. The idea of, just because America now plunks its flag there doesn't mean you're Americans. Doesn't mean that you're automatically guaranteed all the rights as put forth under the Constitution. Okay? That case is a big result of the Spanish-American War, because think about all the territory we had now. We took Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico. All right. Can we go over midnight judges again? Caitlin, yeah, love it. So anyway, the midnight judges were the judges who were appointed by John Adams in the last weeks of his administration. The term itself is a little bit misleading. Implies that Adams has a candle there and he's signing things. Well, when Adams loses the, quote, revolution of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, he not only loses control of the White House, the Federalists lose control of both houses of Congress and most of the governor's offices. So they're terrified that Jefferson's going to come in and basically undo everything that they've worked for in the 12 years that Washington and Adams were in the White House. So they passed this thing called the Judiciary Act of 1801, and they just start appointing Federalist judges left and right to federal courts with the idea that they're going to put so many Federalist judges out there, they're going to somehow be able to check Thomas Jefferson. One of those midnight judges was William Marbury. In the course of the transition toward right at the end, 4 of these judges didn't get their commissions, like their piece of paper saying, hey, you're a federal judge. Marbury is one of them. He went to the new Secretary of State, James Madison, saying, hey, give me my commission. Madison's like, I'm not giving you a commission. You guys are Federalists. Jefferson's the president. He's a Republican. We ain't doing that. And that's what starts the basis for the whole case. Now, the irony is the former Secretary of State, the guy who screwed up and forgot to deliver them, was John Marshall. So now Marshall's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he goes, oh my gosh, this is my screw up. How do I fix it? He tries to order Madison to appear before the Supreme Court and explain why these guys aren't getting their jobs. Jefferson and Madison blow him off, and Marshall goes, oh, what am I going to do? I can't act like this guy doesn't deserve his job because then I'll look like weak. I can't try to make Madison and Jefferson do something because they'll blow me off and the Supreme Court will be weak. So what he ends up doing is he looks in the Constitution. And Marshall in Marbury versus Madison looks and looks and looks and goes, dude, there's nothing in the Constitution that gives me guidance. That's it. That's it. There's nothing in the Constitution that tells me I have the right to order Madison to do his job. And so he declares a law called the Judiciary Act of 1801 unconstitutional. And it was a law that basically had given the Supreme Court the power to compel, to order, to force Jefferson and Madison to do his job. Okay? And in doing so, he basically declares a federal law to be unconstitutional. Jefferson thinks, that's a win for me. And instead, it puts him in a bad situation because, making sure my kid doesn't burn these ribs, it puts him in a bad spot because now all of a sudden Jefferson has to kind of go along with the Supreme Court ruling, even though Marshall has now essentially created power for himself. All right. From Marissa, what is Worcester versus Georgia? Oh, let me skip ahead. I skipped a little bit here. All right. Jana wants to know about McCullough versus Maryland. All right. That's another Marshall case. Again, when you see John Marshall's name, he's either creating judicial review in Marbury versus Madison, or he's giving more power to the national government. John Marshall was a member of the Federalist Party, the same party of Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and John Adams. Now, the funny part is, John Marshall was Thomas Jefferson's cousin from Virginia. How awkward was that Thanksgiving? Jeez, passed potatoes, Federalist jerk. And Marshall, he's going to become like the big pain in Jefferson's butt while Jefferson's president. In fact, he'll be on the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice until 1835. He'll actually have more influence for a longer period of time than Jefferson does. So in 1819, go back in time. Remember Hamilton's Bank of the U.S., the first one? Was created in the 1790s. That died off when Jefferson was president. In 1816, as part of Henry Clay's American system, and guys, of all the words, you have to know that American system is important. That'll be another night, but study it in the meantime. Part of Henry Clay's American system was this brand new national bank, Bank 2.0. That was passed in 1816. In 1819, the state of Maryland wanted to get rid of the national bank. The bank had a branch in Maryland. So Maryland basically said, we're going to put a tax on any banks that are not licensed by the state. In other words, we're going to tax the national bank in Maryland until it goes away. Marshall ends up ruling, no. And this is the famous quote: the power to tax is the power to destroy. We cannot allow a state to have the power to tax something connected with the national government. We can't let a state have power over the national government. Remember, John Marshall, he is a nationalist. Okay? He wants a stronger America. All right? Faith, we talked about judicial review being established in Marbury versus Madison. And Allie, Smith versus Allwright. All right. That's a nice one to know as an extra detail. If you don't know that one, do not bug out. But basically, it was designed to fight racism. It's a case that happens during World War II. And here's what happens. In many southern states, they had laws on the books that basically said political parties could deny membership to people. Why? Because if you're not a member of a political party, then you can't vote in that party's primaries. And in several southern states, there are laws that said basically if you're black, you can't be a member of the Democratic Party, which, if you remember, was the dominant party in the South. The Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional. It denied people their 14th Amendment, and that's the money amendment, guys. The 14th Amendment, because it has equal protection under the law, the Equal Protection Clause. You cannot deny people party membership because you're depriving them of their right to vote and you're depriving them of their equal rights. All right, let's see here. Marissa, what is Worcester versus Georgia? It is John Marshall's last Supreme Court case, guys. 1835. It is related to the Cherokee Trail of Tears. It is related to Andrew Jackson. So let's set this up. In 1830, Jackson's president. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. Jackson basically was authorized by Congress to create a Bureau of Indian Affairs and force the relocation of Native Americans out west of the Mississippi into what then was called Indian Territory. Today we call it Oklahoma. The Cherokee were one of five, what were called back then, five civilized tribes. They had a written language, they had schools, they had a written constitution. Basically, they had done everything they could to basically show, hey, you know, we're legit. We are an established foreign nation. We've done everything you told us to. Well, part of that market revolution was the specialization of crops. And people got what was called Alabama fever. People in Georgia started moving out further and further west because they needed new land for cotton. Remember, cotton's like an ecological time bomb. It depletes the soil. So Georgia begins this process of trying to remove the Cherokee Indians. In 1831, there's a Supreme Court case called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And the Cherokee go to the Marshall Court and they say, hey, John Marshall, we are a sovereign nation. We're a foreign nation, no different than Great Britain. Under the Constitution, only the Supreme Court can deal with foreign nations. Marshall rules, no, you're a dependent Indian tribe. You're not a foreign nation. You have no standing in this court. A couple years later, you have Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester was a white person who was living with the Cherokee, and he basically said, no, I'm not going to be relocated. I refuse to be removed from the land that I'm on. And this kind of becomes the new way to get back in the Marshall Court. And here they kind of play Marshall's tune. They say, John Marshall, technically speaking, only the national government, remember how Marshall thinks, only the national government can deal with Indians. And Marshall says, you're right. Georgia have no right to remove the Cherokees. Only the federal government can deal with Native Americans. The problem is Andrew Jackson's the president. And, well, what happens, Alex Peterson, if the president ignores the Supreme Court's ruling? It depends. In this case, Andrew Jackson is an incredibly popular and powerful president. He's a Democrat. The Democrats control Congress, and nothing happens. Jackson's quote was, John Marshall made his ruling. Let him enforce it. And because no one had the Supreme Court's back and no one had the Cherokees back, this is what sets up the Cherokee Trail of Tears, where 25% of the Cherokee Indians end up dying as they're relocated from western Georgia and areas around there out west to Oklahoma. All right, let's see here. Megan, Hammer versus Dagenhart, Keating-Owen Act. All right, don't freak out on those ones. Okay, I like to always talk about like the inner circle. I told you like the vital cases. Then there's like the it's really good to know. Then there's the it's nice to know. And Hammer versus Dagenhart to me is like in that nice to know. One of the goals of the progressive era was to try to stop child labor. So when Woodrow Wilson was president in 1916, the Keating-Owen Act was passed. And it was a law that was designed to try to put limits on child labor. The Supreme Court in Hammer versus Dagenhart declared it unconstitutional. You will not see effective child labor legislation until the New Deal with FDR and the Fair Labor Standards Act during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And if you remember that, then you're basically good to go. Okay, guys? Let's see here. Morgan, are there any other cases that we should know that happened after World War II for the test? Well, if you're looking for some synthesis, I mean, Brown versus Board of Education, you have to do. I don't think I would even worry about that, Morgan. To be honest, I would say definitely Brown versus Board of Ed. Other than that, now we're getting into like Earl Warren stuff, and that's not till the 1960s. And I don't see the value in trying to force that. Okay. Bennett says Jordan's here. He just can't comment. Well, Bennett, you text Jordan and tell Jordan that he needs to send comments or questions to you. Sarah, court packing. All right. And she says more specifically with Andrew Jackson. So here's the deal, Sarah. Court packing is not Andrew Jackson. That's FDR. Okay. FDR in 1938. He's had two big losses in the Supreme Court. In 1935, you had the Schechter Poultry versus the U.S. case, the case that shot down the Blue Eagle, the NRA. In 1936, you had Butler versus the U.S., the case that declared the AAA. Remember, we're going to pay farmers not to grow stuff. That became unconstitutional. So FDR now decides, I'm losing the same way. I'm always losing 6-3. There were 6 judges who were older, who were more conservative, who were appointed by Republican presidents. They're outvoting the 3 more liberal justices. Pardon me. All right, so what ends up happening is FDR gives one of his fireside chats, and he introduces what's called the Judicial Reorganization Act, where he says, these judges, they're old. And again, I love the way he frames this. It's all folksy, like I'm a nice guy. The judges are old. They need a little bit of help. Let's lighten their workload because they can't keep up with the times. I want to add a new judge for everyone over the age of 70. I can't fire them. Remember, if you're a federal judge, you serve for life. But I want to hire another one. That way, when these guys do retire, their replacement's already been there. He's been trained. He's been working. And oh, what a coincidence. That means there'll be 9 judges who vote my way and 6 who vote against me. Just a coincidence. Now, understand, prior to court packing, Congress had said, yes, sir, Mr. President, sir, I'll do what you want. And now all of a sudden, this scares the heck out of members of Congress, even in FDR's own Democratic Party, who are controlling Congress. Remember, this is the 1930s, your contextualization. This is the time of Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, fascism, dictators. And all of a sudden you have, whoa, FDR, what are you doing? Not only does Congress reject court packing, but this failed court packing plan is one of the things that brings an end to the New Deal. Okay? Let's see here. We have Garrett telling me he's here. Okay. Allie, the Scopes trial is not a Supreme Court case. I am so glad you asked that question, Allie. I can't tell you how many times over the years, because it's such a prominent case. It's a Tennessee case. It's not a federal case. It's a local trial in Dayton, Tennessee. It's not even like big state court. It's just that it became a media, show, because William Jennings Bryan helped the prosecution and Clarence Darrow helped the defense. It just became one of those little things that all of a sudden blew up and got out of control. So no, that is not a Supreme Court case. I'm really glad you asked that. All right, Garrett has a non-court question, but I love it. So hang on. No way I'm getting through this review class without having my little tonic water there. All right. The corrupt bargain. This is what we begin what we call the Age of Jackson with. In 1824, you have an end to what was called the era of good feelings. The 8 years Monroe was president, you only had one party, the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists had died off. After Monroe served his two terms, the problem is there's no one clear successor. You get 4 major candidates. You get Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, and General Andrew Jackson. Now, this is where states, especially in the West, had begun to pass laws to change voting requirements. Remember, throughout early American history, the number one voting requirement was you had to be white, a male, and own property. States began to move to what was called universal male suffrage, drop the property requirement. And that meant you had more people voting. You had the common man voting. Plus, states began to change their election laws to say that, look, the popular vote would determine who gets our state's electoral votes. So now not only can the common man vote, but his vote matters. And that's where we talked about Jackson launching his brand new campaign style. At the end of the day, Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote, which if you have, $2 will get you a small coffee at Dunkin' Donuts. Remember, the popular vote doesn't elect the president. Jackson had the most electoral votes, which is worthless. You must get a majority in the Electoral College. No one, because there were 4 candidates, even though Jackson got the most electoral votes, no one got a majority. So under the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, the amendment that was ratified after the whole Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr fiasco, and if you don't know that, go back into AMSCO. What ended up happening was the House of Reps had to pick. Well, Henry Clay, you're in 4th place. Under the 12th Amendment, the House picks from the top 3 candidates. So Henry Clay, you're out. William Crawford had a stroke. He dropped out. And this is where John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay made a deal. Clay, as Speaker of the House, is able to persuade enough people in the House to vote for Adams. And Adams gives Clay a brand new job. Secretary of State. The same jobs John Quincy Adams had, the same job that Thomas Jefferson had, James Madison had, James Monroe had, the job that was considered the stepping stone to the White House. Okay? And Jackson supporters cried bloody murder. They called it the corrupt bargain, and they immediately started a brand new political party, the Democrats. All righty. Logan, how did U.S. versus EC Knight impact monopolies and trusts? It basically put them in a happy place. They had a safe space. The Supreme Court in 1895 case, U.S. versus EC Knight, was about the American Sugar Company. And the problem with the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, it was written in a very vague kind of way. It was very poorly worded. And the Supreme Court had no ambition to go trying to regulate business. And what they basically said was, the American Sugar Company, they manufacture sugar. They don't transport it. Therefore, they're not in restraint of trade or commerce. Therefore, they don't apply under the Sherman Antitrust Act. And then basically from then until some guy named Teddy Roosevelt came along and went after J.P. Morgan, it kind of like put the corporations, the big trusts, on easy street until that Northern Securities case. Lily, is there anything in period 9 that can connect to any court case? Oh my gosh. I'm going to put out an assignment for you guys soon. By the way, next week, since we're not going to have spring break next week, and if you didn't know that, sorry, someone do CPR for you. We will get spring break eventually, we were told, but we have to do school. We're going to have lots of review next week, and you will notice that assignments get a little bit lighter. Okay? Smile, give me smiley faces, thumbs up on that. But basically, yeah, there's quite a few. For the Northern Securities case and the Standard Oil case, you get connected to stuff about Microsoft and their antitrust issues in the 90s. And if you let me get back to that, because that's a big one, kiddo. All right. Slaughterhouse cases, Matt Kenney. Just understand it's the first time the 14th Amendment is ever actually used by the Supreme Court. And I wouldn't even go past that. Okay. Lauren, if you go back to very early in this review class, and again, this will be posted afterward. I just send it up there to YouTube. I do a big old thing on Gibbons versus Ogden already. Hannah, were there other ways FDR cut back overproduction after Butler? Yes, Hannah, great question. So Butler versus the U.S. declares the AAA to be unconstitutional. And FDR comes up with a new version of the AAA. Today we call it food stamps. Basically what he says is fine. Now we'll have the federal government buy your surplus food, and we'll use that to feed people. Okay? Garrett, we did Worcester versus Georgia. Again, if you go back probably about 8-10 minutes ago when you rewind this sucker. All right. Abby wants to know about Commonwealth versus Hunt. She can't comment. Commonwealth versus Hunt, I will come back to you on a later date because honestly, I'll put that sucker out there in the nice to know. Don't bug on too much. Jordan wants to know, I'm guessing that's Jordan Sanson, wants to know Dred Scott versus Sanford. All right, big one. Like, you can't pass the Regents without this one. It's 1857. All right, so let's go back in time. Diddly. Remember the Missouri Compromise? Maine will be a free state. Missouri will be a slave state. We'll draw that line at 36 degrees, 30 minutes latitude. Everything north of that line is free. Everything south of that line is slave territory. Dred Scott was a slave owned by a U.S. Army surgeon, a guy named whose last name was Emerson. Emerson, because in the military, he travels. Now, Emerson's from Missouri. Scott is from Missouri. And what ends up happening is Emerson, because he's in the Army, gets stationed in different places. In the Free Territory of Wisconsin, in the Free State of Illinois, Reggie. He's up there for years. So long, in fact, that Dred Scott gets married, has a family. They come back to Missouri. Emerson dies. Now, here's a funny example of that whole cult of domesticity and slavery coming together. Mrs. Emerson, she's scared. She's a woman. She's afraid she's legally going to lose challenge. You see, a group of local abolitionists helped Dred Scott sue for his freedom. The Missouri courts, they threw the case out. But Mrs. Emerson was spooked. So on paper, at least, she transferred ownership of Dred Scott over to her brother, a guy named Sanford, who lived in New York, a free state. Now, because at least on paper, this went across state lines, Now it's a federal case. Now it goes up and it goes to the Supreme Court. In 1857, you get a new president, James Buchanan, worst president in American history. Buchanan tries to influence the court. He secretly kind of files a brief, and he kind of speaks to Roger Taney, the Supreme Court justice, and says, I want you to make this go away. Squash this whole slavery thing. Taney's court rules in a 7-2 vote. I think it's 7-2. Forgive me, I am old. Dred Scott, you're a slave. That means you're property, not a person. You can't sue. You have no standing in this court. But a couple of the justices said they were going to write dissenting or disagreeing opinions. That leaves loopholes and openings. So now Taney's spooked. He decides, I have to move inside because it's starting to rain. Taney decides, I'm going to settle this once and for all. He goes on to write this massive decision, and I mean massive and massive and massive decision, in which he says, look, slaves, if you go back to the Constitution, he argues, were never considered people. Therefore, they don't have the rights of people. They were beings of a lesser nature. Hey, John, when you're done eating, cover the grill. Okay. Say hi, James.
Hi.
Okay. So what Taney ends up doing is he ends up trying to justify slavery. He says, look, our founding fathers never intended slaves to be considered as people. They are property. And Taney goes so far as to say, look, if you look at the Fifth Amendment has that due process clause, which says the government cannot take away your right to life, liberty, or due process of law. Therefore, any laws that try to restrict slavery, Taney argues, are unconstitutional. In doing so, he declares the entire gosh darn Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. We are moving to an undisclosed location to try to have quiet here. This tweaks out abolitionists, and rightfully so. Not only are they angry because the Missouri Compromise, which was always the one thing that was always established as, hey, we got this. Not only is that going to be unconstitutional, but now the fear was, what about being a free state? There was actually a case that was set to go before the Supreme Court called Lemon versus New York, challenging this question of, can you be a free state? Luckily, the Civil War happened. I can't believe I'm saying that. And the case never actually was heard by the Supreme Court. Of course, by the time the war was over, you hit the 13th Amendment, kind of making it a moot point. Okay, that was a great one. Let's see here. Garrett, Butler versus the U.S. All right, AAA, FDR, a lot of initials. FDR creates the Agricultural Adjustment Act. We're going to pay farmers not to grow stuff, up to 25% of their land, up to 25% of their crops. And you would pay these farmers through a subsidy. They'd put a tax on like the processor of cotton, the people who milled the grain. And Butler was part of this company, group of companies that were cotton processors. They sued. And again, it was declared unconstitutional. You can't get in right now, James. All right. So 6-year-olds in AP review. It was declared unconstitutional in Butler versus the U.S. And again, that was another one of the cases that helped set up the whole court packing scenario. All right, Jenna, can you go over Debs versus the U.S., sometimes called In re Debs? Don't get too freaked out on it. In fact, all you need to know about Eugene Debs, Jenna, remember Debs is going to go to jail because of the Pullman strike in the 1890s when Grover Cleveland got the court injunction because the railroad companies, they hooked up U.S. mail cars to Pullman cars and said, Debs, your strike now is interfering with the mail. And the other big thing for Debs is the Sedition Act. Debs in 1918 gave a speech against World War I. And there was a guy for the U.S. government right there, like writing down, underlining the seditious things, the big anti-government things he said. Debs was thrown in jail he was sentenced to 10 years. He ended up getting the last part of his sentence commuted in the 1920s. Okay. And I'm looking here. All right. If you don't have any other questions, I have a couple other generic things I'd like to talk about. Please jump in. I like answering your questions, and I miss you guys. So, other big stuff. Supreme Court. There's currently 9 people on it. Understand there is no actual fixed number. 9 has kind of become like established practice. There have been, the original Supreme Court had 1 Chief Justice and 5 associates. There have been court rulings that were 8 judge rulings. There was a 7 judge ruling. But when FDR tried to monkey with the whole idea of how many people would be on the court, that's when checks and balances kind of kicked in. You know what? Rightfully so. One of the things that's like the hallmark of the United States is the fact that we have what's called an independent judiciary. Federal judges, not just Supreme Court judges, they serve for life. Okay, which means that theoretically they cannot be pressured and influenced by Congress or the president. Now, there's exceptions. One, the president gets to appoint these judges, so he's going to obviously pick people he agrees with. But the U.S. Senate has to approve those appointments. And a judge, other stuff here. We talked about court packing. We talked about John Marshall. He's the big one. Anytime you see his name on the AP test, it's either judicial review or more power to the national government. Roger Taney, that's Dred Scott. And really, guys, that's all I have going up through the end of period 7. Does anybody have any other questions? Because the one thing I could think of is go through that Google slide. Know the amendments that or parts of the Constitution that apply to court cases. Dred Scott, 5th Amendment, the Due Process Clause. Plessy versus Ferguson, the 14th Amendment. Schenck versus the U.S., first. Korematsu, the 5th and the 14th Amendments. Schechter Poultry versus the U.S. isn't an amendment thing, but that goes back to this idea of federalism. What role does the federal government have? So for Munn versus Illinois, Wabash versus Illinois, and Schechter, it's a question of what powers does Congress have? Congress can regulate interstate trade, meaning business that goes across state lines. State governments can regulate businesses that stay within the state. Trying to think here off the top of my head. Gibbons versus Ogden. That's another one that goes on this. So Gibbons, Munn, Wabash, Schechter. And really, guys, that's about all I have for you tonight. This will be posted up on YouTube. And Jordan wants to know about Eugene Debs. Okay, Debs was the five-time Socialist Party candidate. He was the head of the American Railway Union. He ran for president 5 times, like we said. And Debs's labor actions were more likely to end in strikes. Debs wanted to kind of like change American society. He was a socialist. And in many ways, you could say like the whole progressive movement was an effort to try to get people, to get capitalism fixed and keep it away from socialism. Logan, barbecue sauce of choice. If I'm not being lazy, it's make my own. I make a mean barbecue sauce, a little KC kind of sauce, a little molasses. Yeah, it's real good. If I'm in a pinch, I love me some Sweet Baby Ray's, but I'm not going to lie. Wegmans, believe it or not, Wegmans has some really good barbecue sauces I've been using lately. Any other questions, my peeps? Okay. So we have a class on Thursday, Cold War Foreign Policy. I already videotaped a lecture for you guys. I hope you like it. We'll get one more new content thing before we go heavy review, and that's pop culture in the Cold War, because there's some connections to 1950s, the impact of the Cold War at home, to going even back to like colonial times. And it's just a really fun class. And then until I hear otherwise, I got to assume eventually we're going to, have a Regents, but I'm going to do heavier on the review. Okay. Until then, log off and plug in your chromies, homies. I miss you guys. Bye.